all of the, a panel like that. What they need is a folktale.
Yeah.
So it's something like sink your teeth into. It's like fish and chips, hearty, delicious, with malt vinegar.
We're holding things up. Should we be up there? Should we be up there?
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to the 2014 National Storytelling Network Conference Fringe, show number 1.
Because it's the best!
You have made an excellent choice.
Oh yeah.
Old, moldy stories told by young, talented people. That's all I need to say. I'm getting on the way, and here they are.
Hello. Thank you for coming. Turn off your cell phones. That'd be great.
Please.
Please. Please. Anne's here to keep me in line. My name is Cassie Cushing.
I'm Ann Harding.
And we are going to be sharing some folk tales with you this evening. So we're very, very glad that you are here. I will be kicking off the evening. So if you want to sit down. I will be kicking off the evening. We decided to put together a selection of winter stories to combat the eternal summer that is Phoenix. And so the first story I would like to share with you is it's a variation. Oh no, cell phones. It's a variation on a Slavic folktale where sometimes the winters can seem interminable, and maybe that's a nice contrast to coming into town today. It can be hard for 3 women to make it on their own. Well, really more like one woman and her 2 daughters who were almost women. Helen and Marukla were sisters. And Helen knew that life was hard, but for her it wasn't quite so bad. Because she discovered early on that if she smiled in just the right way and said things or didn't say things in just the right ambiguous kind of way, that she could kind of get away with things or get certain things. And so for Helen, she knew life was hard, but it wasn't so bad. For Marukla, well, she knew that life could be worse, but sometimes that can either be a small consolation or just an empty nothing. And for their mom, well, she was tired. It was the middle of winter. The snow was knee-deep on the ground outside, and the wind was just barely whistling through the trees. Helen sat in front of the fire with a blanket pulled up over her lap. Marukla sat off on the side next to the drafty window, and she had one basket that was full of fibers for spinning, and she had another basket that she had already spun that she was knitting, and another basket of socks that needed fixing. And their mother was in the kitchen. Marukla, oh, this fire, it feels so nice. It is just warming my soul. It is so good to sit here. I needed this. I do so much for our family. I have garnered so much goodwill in town, and oh, this fire, it is relaxing me so much. I needed this. The winter is so long, and oh, I miss the violets, Marukla. Don't you miss the violets? Maybe you could find me some. Oh, that would make this moment perfect. And Marukla was working on her knitting, and she just looked at her sister. It's snowing, and it's the middle of winter. I don't think I can find violets. Well, it's just, it would be so nice, you know, because I've got this fire and it's making me feel better, and well, maybe Mother will have something to say about it. Mother, I've asked Marukla for just a simple favor, and she's just sitting there by the window, you know, with all this yarn. It's just a small thing. And a heavy sigh emanated from the kitchen. The mother walked out. She looked at Helen and she looked at Marukla. Marukla, why do you have to give your sister such a hard time? I mean, I don't know what she wants or why you're not helping, but we're a family. So without another word, their mother crossed the room to where Marukla was sitting, grabbed her by the arm, walked to the door. As she opened it, a gust of icy cold wind came rushing in, and Marukla went out. The door closed behind her with a solid lock. No. What? It's cold. And she couldn't even bring herself to try the doorknob. She just turned and started walking out into the night, into the darkness, where the snow was falling all around her. She couldn't see a thing, and it wasn't too long before she was lost. Every step was hard as she sunk through that knee-deep snow. And all she could feel was the ground beneath her feet, and that it was starting to get steeper and steeper and steeper, and she fell a number of times, but she could make out a light in the distance. So she kept her eyes on that light, and she climbed and she climbed and she climbed. When she finally got to the top, a whole clearing spread out in front of her, and that light had become a huge bonfire. Sitting around the bonfire were 12 men. The first 3 were old, older than time. And the next 3 were a little bit younger, and so on around the circle until, well, the last 3, they were quite handsome. Marukla stood just at the edges of the shadow. Her fingers had curled in from the cold, and she couldn't even feel the blood running down her knees from the number of times that she'd fallen on the ice in the snow. She waited only a moment, made her way forward. Please, it's so cold. The oldest man sat in a large throne with a beard that grew out of his face and hung down his belly. And so Marukla came to the fire, and slowly she could feel its heat, and her fingers started to uncurl. Her breathing became more regular. What brings you out in this snow, in this beautiful storm that I've created? Violets? I need some violets. This is my winter. There are no violets. Brother March, come, sit on the throne. And so Father December rose and snowflakes fell off his shoulders. March came. As soon as he sat, the air was warm. The snow melted into that deep, dark, brown earth. And before you could blink an eye, it was covered in green. And before you could blink the other eye, flecks of purple were peeking out from the green. There are your violets. And so Marukla rushed forward. She used her skirt and filled it with these delicate, wilting flowers. And from there, she was able to make her way back home. I brought violets! And the door opened a crack. And the door opened further. And Helen scooped up all the violets. She offered some to her mother, who tried to smile but sighed. And the next day, Helen was sitting in her chair in front of the fire. Oh, Marukla, those violets, those were so great, but you know, in the dead of this winter, strawberries would just be so good. Strawberries? I don't think I can find strawberries. And a sigh emanated from the kitchen. And as Marukla could hear her mother's footsteps shuffling over, she was already on her feet and making her way to the door. And this time, June took the throne. And the air became as balmy and as warm as a midsummer's day. A midsummer's day in some place reasonable, like California. But we're in Arizona, so we'll say it was as warm as a midsummer's night. And the ground was covered in green, and kisses of red were just peeking out from underneath the leaves. As Marukla rushed forward, she could smell the sweetness of those strawberries, which she carried home. Helen was sitting in the fire, in front of the fire. Oh, what I wouldn't give for some apples. They're crunchy and sweet. And Marukla didn't even say a word. She just got up and walked to the door and let herself out. September sat on the throne. And the air didn't really warm up enough to melt the snow. It kept that crisp edge. The leaves on the trees were not vibrant and green, but brilliant oranges and deep reds that fluttered, hanging on with one last little grasp of life. And at the edge of the clearing was an apple tree. Apples mottled with red and golden yellows. Marukla walked up to the tree. With one shake, an apple fell with a soft plop. And with another shake, a second apple fell. Stop! 2 is all you get. And so Marukla took the 2 apples back home, and there was Helen sitting in front of the fire. There are your apples. Only 2? Where are the rest? There's more at the top of the Crystal Mountain. Well, why didn't you bring them back? You only brought 2 apples. Can't you do anything right? I do so much, and I just asked for this one thing. I will, fine, I will go. And so Helen got up and she left. She walked to the top of the Crystal Mountain. She saw the bonfire, the 12 men sitting around. Hi, I'm looking for apples, and I heard there were apples here. Maybe you can help me. I just want to take care of my family because I like to do that. And if I brought back some apples, oh, everyone would be so happy. December took one look at her, and then turned back to the fire. The wind began to pick up. It started whistling, it started howling. Marukla and her mother were back at home. Time was ticking by. There was a sigh and a shuffle in the kitchen. I should get some apples. And the mother left. And the icicles were hanging from the trees like claws, but that wind was blowing harder and faster, and they were clinging together almost. And then the snow started to fall. It fell heavy and thick and fast. Marukla was home alone. The chair was empty. The wind was blowing so hard that the door was just rattling in its frame. So she got up and she walked over, and with a satisfying click, turned the key. And then she walked over to that chair by the fire. She pulled the blanket up over her lap. And that howling wind and the bitter cold outside was the perfect contrast to the comfort and the warmth that Marukla finally felt on the inside. So, it's hot outside. I love the imagery in that story, and that is why one of the many reasons why I was attracted to that story. And we have 2 more stories for you. So I would like to now welcome Anne up to the stage. And we're going to switch the mic because we're being recorded for posterity.
Stays on. It got me all relaxed, which is a good thing. Black is the color of my true love's hair. His face is soft and wondrous fair. The purest eyes and the strongest hands. I love the ground whereon he stands. 2 rose bushes stood outside of a widow's cottage. One twined around the other. One bloomed white and the other bloomed red. And within the cottage lived the widow and her 2 daughters, one snow white and the other rose red. And while the sisters were as close as sisters would be, they were also as different as sisters often are. Now Rose Red, she was of red hair and a fiery disposition, and her favorite place was outside in the forest. She would find where the fox had hid her kits that year. She would figure out where the fawns were nesting with their mothers, and she would find the mushrooms hiding in those dark spaces. And her sister Snow White, dark of hair and dark of eye, her place was the home. She would sweep the house within an inch of its life. She would take the kettle and she would shine it until it gleamed as if it was gold. And every day she would gather wildflowers and bring them to the middle of the table to add a little bit of color to the room. Now they both loved their mother as much as each other, and you would often find the 3 of them together. In the summertime, they would be down beside the river, and their mother would take great joy in reading her daughter a book or her daughter's books, or perhaps singing them a song she knew. And Rose Red would cut the rushes from beside the river and bring them to Snow White, who would weave them into baskets to take to market. And in the wintertime was Snow White's favorite, because they would gather around the hearth, and Rose Red would card the wool that they had gotten from their small flock of sheep, pulling the fibers straight, pulling the burrs out, and handing great piles of the white fluff to her sister Snow White, who would then spin it into long white thread, while their mother sat with them and read and sang. And so it was on a night like this, when the wind whipped up and the hearth seemed cheerier for the cold outside, that they sat around the fire doing these tasks, and there was a knock at the door. "Rose Red," said their mother, "go to the door and find who is there. Perhaps it is some poor traveler, and we must offer him the comfort of our fire." Rose Red sprang and went to the door, and unlatching it opened, expecting to find a traveler, but instead a great bear's head thrust its way into the cottage. She stepped back, a scream on her lips, and Snow White's already coming from her mouth. Their mother rose, and the bear said, "Do not be afraid. I mean you no harm. I'm simply frozen out here. Would you allow me to sit by your fire?" Now, whether it was a bear that could talk, or the kindness in his voice, their mother sat down in her chair again and said, "Please come in. Take care not to singe your coat near the fire, but please join us." Now Rose Red opened the door a bit further, and Snow White moved to move their things away, and the bear lumbered in, great black coat, white across the top, and settled in front of the fire with a singe and a sizzle. The mother watched her girls as Rose Red closed the door and turned and looked at the great black mountain in front of their fire. Snow White did not sit to her spinning again, and so watching her daughter so concerned, she said, "Rose Red, Snow White, go get your brooms and sweep our guest. Get the snow off his coat so that he'll not be any colder." So they did, and very cautiously approached the bear and began to sweep the white off of his coat onto their stone floor. Well, she could see their hands were shaking from the nervousness, but the bear was grumbling in a contented sort of growl. And so their mother, to soothe them, began to sing. "Black is the color of my true love's hair. His face so soft and wondrous fair. The purest eyes and the strongest hands. I love the ground whereon he stands. I love my love, and well he knows. I love the ground whereon he goes. If you know more on earth I see, I can't serve you as you have me." And their mother, singing, comforted them. And after the bear had been swept clean and was heaving great sighs, they returned to their spinning and watched the bear as their mother continued to sing and read. And when the time had come to douse the lamps and go to their beds, their mother said, "Please stay the night. You would surely freeze outside." And the bear agreed. And Rose Red and Snow White did not sleep very well that night, but listened to the snoring of their great guest. Now the next morning, Snow White got up to start the fire, and the bear was already standing, his face pointed towards the door, sniffing at the bits of the morning air that were seeping in through the cracks. And she went to let him out and opened the door wide and said, "Surely if it is cold outside tonight as it was last night, you should return and take comfort by our fire." And the bear nodded. And as he left out their door, she reached out and touched the coarse black fur. And so a strange winter was passed. Their guest would arrive every night, and Rose Red made it a point to not lock the door until he had arrived. They grew used to his snores near the fire every night, a strange lullaby. And every morning, Snow White would let him out the door and reach a hand out and let it cross past his hair. And then one day, when the winter had about blown itself out, and the snow that had fallen had melted the same day it had come down, the bear turned to Snow White and said, "I will come again no more. Summer is on its way." "Where will you go, dear bear?" she said. "Will you not come and join us in the evenings?" "No," he said. "The dwarves who seek to steal my treasure will come above ground now that the ground is soft, and I must be out and about to keep them from their business." Well, before she could say much else, the bear swung and was off into the woods again, and she reached out for one last touch, and as he hurried through the door, his hair caught upon the latch and was pulled away, and she saw a glint of gold, but before she could ask him about it, he was gone and into the forest. She told her mother and her sister of the bear's departure, and while they were sorry to see their guest go, spring has its busyness. There were the lambs, there was the garden, there was the preparation for the coming summer, and so they were all quite busy. And then came the day that Rose Red could stand it no longer. She came to her sister Snow White and said, "Leave your broom. The forest is singing to me, and I can bear it no longer. Come, we should go gather firewood. We need it." And Snow White, having spent almost enough time in the house, left her broom. And they went into the forest. And they gathered sticks, and they looked to see where the robins had placed their nests this year, and to see what fresh green shoots were starting to come up. And as they went about, they came across a fallen tree, and they heard a strange noise. And at the end, they saw something hopping and jumping around. And as they came around the back of the tree, near the root and the trunk, they came across a very strange sight. There was a man, a very small man, about the size up to their knees, who had a very long beard, about as long as he was tall. And he somehow was stuck to the tree, and he was pulling at the length of his beard and hopping about like a dog on a leash. And the girls stood and watched him. And then one of them said, "What are you doing?" And his face turned towards them, and it was wrinkled, and his eyes were hard as stones. And he says, "What does it look like I'm doing? I'm stuck. Are your boots and your heads filled with stones, or are you going to come help me?" Well, the girls, being kind-hearted, Rose Red went to pry apart the tree, and Snow White began to tug at the beard. And Rose Red said, How did this happen?" And he said, "Well, I was chopping wood for my fire, and I drove my wedge in, and it slipped, thus catching my beautiful beard and leaving me at the mercy of you two ninnies." Well, they continued to try to pull, and Rose Red said, I will go get help." He says, "What good will that do? There are already two of you too many." Well, Snow White said, "Wait, let me think for just a moment." And then she reached into her apron and she pulled out her sewing scissors, and before the dwarf could say anything, she snipped off the end of his beard. Well, the dwarf had been pulled at tension, and so when the tension was released, he went flying over backwards, and when he sat up, he inspected his beard, and with a shriek went towards the girls. Well, they stepped back, and Rose Red's foot happened to hit a bag that had been hidden among the roots. The dwarf, seeing that she had found it, darted forward and grabbing it, and it jingled of a merry coin. And shrieking at them, he turned and he went into the woods, throwing curses over his shoulder. The girls watched him go and spoke of it a bit, and then they brought the tale home to their mother, and she thought it was quite odd to find a dwarf in their woods, but they really didn't think of it too much longer, because spring began to roll into summer, and the rose bushes outside first showed those green buds, and then they began to show the buds of the roses, and you could see at the very top the red and the white, and you knew that soon they would burst into bloom. And at that time, they had had a very particular busy day, and their mother said, "Girls, go down to the river, cool your feet, and catch us some fish." The girls did not need to be told twice. Off they went, down to the river, over tree and under tree, until they could see the winding river through the woods. And then they saw a strange sight. There was something hopping along the banks. First it was one step forward, and then it was another step back, but it was slowly and surely getting closer to the water's edge. And they saw that it was their friend, well, acquaintance, the dwarf. And he had somehow gotten his beard tangled in a line with a fish. And this fish, being about the size he was pulling him towards the water. And he would struggle backwards, and then he'd hop forward and struggle backwards. Until finally Snow White said, "You're not going to go in there after it, are you?" And the dwarf saw them and said, "No, help me, you ninnies!" And down they came. Rose Red taking the line, and Snow White seeing what she could do to untangle the mess. But it was of no use. It was quite tangled. And so for a second time, Snow White reached into her pocket, pulled out her scissors, and snipped the end of his beard. And they all fell backward into the mud. Well, the girls looked at each other, small grins forming on their faces, but the dwarf sat up and inspected it, and he said, "It is not enough that you would ruin it once, but now it is twice shorter, and I will never be able to show myself to my friends again." So distressed was he that he continued to yell, and he reached into the mud at his feet, and he pulled up what seemed to be some weeds. But then he stepped forward, and swishing them in the water, happened to hold strings of pearls. And then continuing to abuse them, he walked down the stream, throwing curses over his shoulder. Well, the girls stood up to start wringing out their petticoats. And as they did so, Snow White touched Rose's arm and said, "Rose, look." And across the river was a bear, a great black bear. And Snow White moved forward, and Rose said, "No, we don't know if it's our bear." And so Snow White began to sing. "Black is the color of my true love's hair. His face so soft and wondrous fair. The purest eye and the strongest hands. I love the ground whereon he stands." The bear stood with his ears turned towards them, sniffing the air. And then he heard the shriek of the dwarf cursing his way down the river, and turned his head that way, and his left lip pulled up in a snarl, and he began to stalk down the riverside. Well, the girls, not wanting to meet with the bear, who did not seem happy and did not seem to be their bear, slowly backed away and went home to their mother with sodden petticoats and a very interesting story to tell. And so the summer continued, and the roses began to bloom. And first there was a white, and then a red, and the fragrance they gave off was just magical. So every day they would go and they'd pluck a stem, and they'd bring it inside to fill the cottage with this smell. And so one day, their mother called them and said, "Girls, go into town and get some needle and some thread and some ribbon. It is time to do our mending." And so the girls, arm in arm, went out through the woods onto the moor, where the green hills were stretching with the rocks dotted across it. And as they were walking, they happened to notice something very strange happening near the road. There was a large eagle, and it happened to be carrying something that was kicking and screaming and cursing. And the girls, realizing who it was, went to go help him, one taking his foot and the other his hand, and pulling a strange tug of war with the eagle until it let go with a shriek of frustration, and down came the dwarf. As you can imagine, the dwarf was not very grateful. Up he got, looking and saying, "Now you ruined my clothes. First my beard and then my clothes. You would have been eaten. I could have handled myself better than you could." Well, the girls let him continue to scream and fight, and they left him walking along, and they saw him reach beneath a rock, pull out a bag, and it seemed to clatter of stone. But they paid no mind to his strange ways as he went off into the rocks, and they continued on their way down to town. And so they bought their needle and their thread and their ribbon, and they began their way back just as the sun was beginning to set. And they were very close to the woods where the rocks were beginning to get thick when among the green and the gray flashed blue, a strange color to have glimmer from these places. And the girls wove their way between the rocks until they came across the dwarf, who had spilled the bag on the ground, and it was gems gems of colors the girls had never seen all in one place. The blue of the troubled ocean, the green of those first buds on the bush, the red of a deep sunset, and the white of a snowfall. And they stood there, staring. And the dwarf saw them staring, and his face went from red to purple. And he began to scream. I knew you had a plan in mind. First you ruined my beard, then my clothes, and now you wish to take my treasure. And down he reached to pick up a rock, and he began to come towards them, screaming, and the girls began to back up. And then a growl came. A growl came from the edge of the woods, followed by a great black bear. And the dwarf, turning, dropped the rock and went from purple to white. And the bear came up, looming over the top with his arms outstretched, and the dwarf began to cry. And he said, "Please, I'm too young, I'm too small, eat those fat girls, please, I'm too small." But the dwarf, his pleas fell on empty ears, because the bear took his paw and crashed it across the dwarf, and the dwarf went tumbling end over end until he hit a rock and moved no more. And the girls, they began to pick up their skirts and run. And they began running for the edge of the forest when they heard a voice behind them saying, "Girls, wait, I will come with you." And they were still running when the voice began to sing. "Black is the color of my true love's hair. Her lips are like the roses fair, the purest eyes and the gentlest hands. I love the ground whereon she stands." And Snow White grabbed her sister, and spinning around, they saw the bear, their bear, coming first on all fours and then standing up on two. And his skin seemed to be moving, it seemed to be writhing, it seemed to be rejecting him. It began to peel away from him until it fell to the ground, and there in front of them stood a man with wild dark hair, dark, wild eyes, in a suit of tattered gold. And the girl stood speechless, but he had thought often of what he might say. And he said, "Please let me explain." "My brother and I are lords of a neighboring province. And as we were riding one day, we came across this dwarf who demanded our treasure. And we would not give it to him. So he cursed us to wear the skins of a bear until we could defeat him. And he continued to steal our treasure, and we continued to hunt him. And as some know, a dwarf keeps his magic in his beard. And because of your kindness to him, Snow White, you shortened his magic, and thus freed us to find him and so defeat him." Well, with some of it explained, the girls invited him home to meet their mother. And while their mother was pleased to have such a fine guest in the house, she insisted she give him a haircut and make him a new suit of clothes. And so refreshed, he went into the woods to find his brother. And he brought out another young man, wild of hair, wild of eye, perhaps more wild than he was, as he had not spent any year in the comfort of humans. And as these stories often go, Snow White happened to marry the bear that stayed with them all winter. And after some mutual taming, Rose Red and the other brother also wed. And the four of them went with their mother to the Lord's palace. And they brought their rose bushes with them, planted them on either side of the gate, where they grew up and around the gate, twining one around the other, one blooming red and the other blooming white. So, Cassie's going to finish us up this evening.
Yes. Yes.
I don't know if you need anything else than that.
Thank you.
Wardrobe change.
Yep. So seasons change. Winter turns to spring, to summer, and bears come and go. But winter and spring sometimes brush up against each other. And one carries with it the sweet embrace of rest and sleep. The other carries with it the promise and the potential of new life. One has an edge of bitterness, and the other has an edge of sweetness. Winter and spring had a daughter. The three of them existed together in a cycle for eternity, until one day, their daughter wondered what it would be like to be human. It was the first snowfall of the season. An old couple sat inside their small, drafty little cottage. The fire was blazing in the hearth, a heat that could keep the cold at bay. And it was early morning. The snow was falling. They were cradling warm cups of tea in their hands. Peace, silence, solitude spread in front of them as they looked out their window at the town center. But the peace didn't last long because the snow was falling fast and it was falling thick. And so before too long, the silence was shattered by peals of laughter and screeching as all of the neighborhood children rushed out into the snow and snowballs went flying from every direction. Well, for this old couple in their cottage, that moment of tranquility suddenly took on sort of a bittersweet edge. With a sigh, the old woman stood up, still holding her tea that had one last sip left. And finishing it, she set it down. She turned to her husband. "Come. We can make our own snow child." And he looked at her with this expression of complete surprise. Even after years of marriage, she could still surprise him with these moments of pure joy. And so they bundled on an extra sweater, and they wrapped up their scarves, they pulled the hats down close, and they went out. Snow angels flew across the city center, while snowballs whizzed overhead. But they found a tree, and with their mittened hands, they piled the snow up, and they tried to carve out an outline till it was a nice mound. They found a stick, and they used this to add what they thought might be a cute little chin, and then little sleeping eyes, and old crusty dried up leaves to add a wisp of downy hair. They had spent so much time making their little snow child that they hadn't even noticed that the laughter was quieter and less frequent as all the children had run inside for hot soup and fresh bread. So as they sat there looking at their little snow child, they of course didn't see two stray snowballs come flying from out of nowhere and hitting them smack in the face. But when they looked back, their snow child was gone, and there was a baby in the snow. And you can't leave a baby in the snow, so the old woman scooped the baby up. "We have a child." And the child was cooing and giggling with a fistful of snow that she had somehow managed to snatch, and she was shoving it in her face. The little dimpled cheeks, and the old woman brought the baby inside. She bounced it and she sang to it, but she noticed that if she ever got too close to the fire, the baby just started wiggling around and letting out these awful screeches. And so she stayed closer to the drafty window. And when she took the baby outside, the icicles hung from the rooftop, and the baby would wiggle out a little hand and break one off. She ate icicles like they were candy canes. In a period of only a few short days, their little baby snow child had grown up into a young woman. She had long, straight hair that hung past her shoulders, pale enough to be almost white, but glinted gold in the sun. Her skin opaque as a frosted lake. Eyes cracked and frosty like a window pane. And so they called her Sniguruchka. Sniguruchka, the snow maiden. Well, Sniguruchka was a shy girl, and she kept mostly to herself, but she loved her parents. She learned quickly, and so her mother taught her to knit and to weave and to spin and to make soup, but she just stuck to chopping up the vegetables because the soup was too hot. And her father taught her how to sharpen knives, and her favorite thing was to go out in the snow and chop the wood because she didn't need a coat. But her parents worried about her. She was very quiet. Sniguruchka, you should go out. You should make friends. We're old and boring. You should have friends your own age. Oh, I'm very happy. And so they lived together. Well, one day, the streets erupted in color. Music, dancing, gaiety, frivolity. It was the midwinter festival. And there sat Sniguruchka at her chair, looking out at the street. There were so many colors. Everybody had put on their brightest scarves and their most colorful hats to battle that dismal gray sky that hung so low overhead and the muddy brown and white snow in the streets. Sniguruchka, go out! Well, that was all the urging she needed. She rushed outside, and there were so many people. Kupava was the belle of the town. She had rich, luxuriant curls that tumbled over her shoulder, raven black, deep, dark eyes that glinted with mysteries yet to be discovered, and lips that you could drown in. She saw Sniguruchka as she came out of the house, and it was a small town. She thought she knew everyone, and here was a girl she'd never met. Hello! You're new! I am Kupava. What is your name? Sniguruchka. Sniguruchka. What a funny name. Come with me. I will show you around. I will introduce you to everyone. We will eat hot nuts and drink tea and go dancing. And so Kupava and Sniguruchka were best friends right off the bat. You must meet Lil. This is Lil. He's our shepherd boy. He plays on the flute so magnificently. Lil, this is Sniguruchka. And Sniguruchka looked at Lil. She smiled. Hello. And Lil looked at Sniguruchka and tried not to turn red, and he shuffled his feet in the snow. Hi. And so Sniguruchka and Lil and Kupava were inseparable. Oh, I can't wait for you to meet Mezgir. Mezgir is my lover. He's a traveling merchant, and he has seen all of the far lands. He comes back with so many stories. And when he comes, he'll be here soon because it's the festival, and I'll get to introduce you. And sure enough, there he was, just at the other end of the square. She rushed up to him. This is Sniguruchka. She's my new friend. And now that you're here, well, we can go dancing because, Lil would have had to dance with both of us, but now I can dance with you, and Lil can dance with Sniguruchka. And so they danced. But as Mezgir held Kupava tight and whirled her around the dance floor, he was looking over her shoulder at this pale, new young maiden that he'd never seen before. Well, merchants come and merchants go, and so Mizgir went. And when he came back, it was straight to Sniguruchka's house that he went. He knocked on the door. "Come dance with me." "Oh, is Kupava coming? Where is she?" "Oh, she's happy at home. Come out and dance with me." I don't know. I don't know. "Well, you could just let me in and then we'll sit and talk." Okay. And every day, Mizgir came to Sniguruchka's house. "Come dance with me." "Oh, I couldn't. I couldn't." And Kupava didn't even know that Mizgir was back in town until the rumors started flying from house to house to house, and then she heard. And when she heard, a black hole formed, and the tears wouldn't stop falling as she ran through town, burst through Sniguruchka's door. "How could you do this to me? You were my friend, and Mizgir danced with me, and I loved him, and he's gonna marry you? No, I'm sorry, no, that's not, no." "I thought we were friends." And with that, the tears stopped. Kupava turned, and with a flurry of curls following her, she stalked out. She went to the mayor's house. She told her story. "I have no honor left." And so the mayor called Sniguruchka. Sniguruchka had mostly only seen her parents' small, humble little cottage. And so when she got to the mayor's house, it was so big. Furs on the floor, paintings on the wall, marble statues. And there he sat in a large armchair, and there was Kupava with fire in her eyes. "You have dishonored this woman. You have taken her man. What do you say for yourself?" "No, I don't understand. I don't understand. I danced with Lil. I said no." And so the mayor looked at Sniguruchka and he looked at Kupava. "There is no injury here that I can fix. Go home. Go home." Kupava glared fire at Sniguruchka, and she walked out. And Sniguruchka slowly made her way home, but Kupava, she couldn't go home. The tears had started flowing again, and all she could do was wander the streets, wander around through the night, until she made her way to the town well and just collapsed in a heap in front of it, sobbing her heart out until the tears wouldn't come anymore. And then when she was exhausted and truly well spent, with a shaking hand, she reached up to the top of the well and she pulled herself to her knees with her arms on the well, and she tumbled in. Sniguruchka was at home, when she heard the news, and all she could do was just sit in her chair by the window, and she just stared off into the distance. Every day, Lil came and he tapped at the window, but she just stared. Her parents, of course, were worried. Sniguruchka, we know it's hard, it hurts. We're so sorry. As time passed, she slowly became a little bit more active and would at least help out around the house, chopping the vegetables and knitting, but it was always with this dead look in her eye. And still, Lil came every day. He tapped at the window. Time continued to pass. The gray sky didn't hang down quite so low. The snow stopped falling and started melting until the world turned from gray to brown. And still every day, Lil came and he tapped at the window. And she saw him. She got up, she opened the door, she threw her arms around him. And this tightness that she had felt knotting deeper and deeper and deeper inside her was still so tight. As she just threw her arms around him. Can we go for a walk? Yes, whatever you want. And so they went out and they walked through the town. They left the town, they went to the edge of the forest. And Sniguruchka could feel that the ground wasn't quite as hard beneath her feet as it had been before. And where the sun shone more frequently, there were almost little flecks of green poking out of the ground as they made their way into the woods. She found a large tree curled up in its roots. Will you play your flute? Please, Lil. I just want to hear something beautiful. And so Lil took out his flute and he began to play. The sun was streaming through the trees. He played a beautiful melody to welcome in the spring, and Sniguruchka could finally feel that knot melt away, and the tears just flowed down her face while the sun shone. And while she was crying and crying and crying, there was a hint of a smile that began to show up as she looked at Lil playing his flute. Lil played his flute in the woods, and he played a beautiful, sweet melody to welcome in the spring. And he stood under a tree, and he was alone. At the base of the tree was a puddle, and rising from the puddle were wisps of steam. Winter and spring often brush up against each other, and one carries with it this sweet embrace of sleep and rest, and one the potential for new life. One has an edge of bitterness, and the other has an edge of sweetness. Lil would often go and visit that old couple in the cottage. Winters would come. The snow would lie thick on the ground, but when the wind picked up and made its way through that drafty window, those tendrils of cold, and the cold came in, it didn't cut them to the core quite the way that it once had.